This video was brought to you by Brilliant. For most of its existence, Uber has had an image problem. When successive scandals finally forced out its notorious leader and CEO Travis Kalanick in 2017, Uber was losing money and lawsuits, and the company looked like it was on its last legs. 7 years later though, and everything's changed. Its stock is at an all-time high, it dominates the ride-hailing industry, and it's finally turning a profit. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Uber's remarkable recovery and its new CEO's plans to turn it into the West's first super app. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, let's start with an abridged history of Uber, because, well, it's a pretty incredible story. Uber was founded way back in 2009 by two Silicon Valley entrepreneurs called Garrett Camp and Travis Kalanick, both of which had sold their own startups a couple of years earlier. The idea was born when Camp and Kalanick spent $800 hiring a private driver on New Year's Eve, and realized that they could massively undercut the existing market by creating a more efficient system via an app. Originally, Uber was actually called UberCab, and it only offered black luxury cars or limos, driven by professional licensed drivers. These actually cost a lot more than bog standard taxis, but were still cheaper than the other premium equivalents, and the app also made hailing a ride way easier. Anyway, taxi drivers still didn't like UberCab because they thought that they were stealing their business, and would often pressure local politicians and regulators to ban the app. UberCab's way around this was to rename the company as simply Uber in 2011, and then to expand into new cities so rapidly that by the time that regulators and incumbent taxi operators noticed, Uber would be too popular to ban. When regulators did try and ban the app, Uber would resort to more legally dubious measures, often at Kalanick's instruction. In 2014, for instance, after Uber launched in Portland despite being explicitly told not to, government officials started trying to hail Ubers so that they could fine the drivers, only for their rides to be repeatedly cancelled thanks to a secret software in the Uber app called Grayball that used credit card data and social media to identify law enforcement officers and deny them rides. Nonetheless, even if it didn't endear them to politicians, this strategy of seeking forgiveness rather than permission was immensely successful, and Uber expanded rapidly. However, in 2012, a competitor finally emerged: Lyft. The big difference between Uber and Lyft at the time was that Lyft didn't use professional drivers or fancy black cars. Instead, anyone with a car, a driving license, and some free time could become a Lyft driver, pioneering the model that Uber now uses today. Originally, Uber tried to convince regulators to ban Lyft, but when it didn't work, they just copied them, launching UberX, Uber's equivalent to Lyft, in April 2013. To stay ahead of Lyft and other companies, Kalanick used every trick in the book. Uber hired recruiters and influencers to keep drivers on the app, hired former CIA agents to spy on its rivals, and Uber employees were even caught ordering and then cancelling rides on competing apps to disrupt their services. But the main reason Uber was able to stay ahead was cash. Uber raised an obscene amount of money and then burnt through its enormous cash pile, effectively subsidizing rides to make sure that Uber offered the cheapest rides around. To compete with Uber on price, other platforms would need to run on a loss, and none of them had as deeper pockets as Uber, which made an eye-watering $100 million loss in the second quarter of 2014 alone. While Kalanick's underhand and arguably unfair business tactics were always controversial in the industry, investors tolerated them because they credited them with Uber's success. However, in 2017, a series of scandals convinced investors that Kalanick's brash leadership style was more of a liability than an asset. In January, Kalanick's links to newly elected President Trump and Uber's decision to continue providing rides to and from JFK Airport while New York cabbies went on strike against Trump's so-called Muslim ban sparked the Delete Uber hashtag on Twitter, which inspired something like 500,000 people to delete their accounts. Then, that February, a former employee called Susan Fowler published a blog post detailing how, almost immediately after joining Uber in early 2016, her manager had propositioned her for sex. She then reported him to HR, only to be told that her manager wouldn't be meaningfully reprimanded because he was a, quote, high performer. and that she could either apply to transfer to another team or stick it out, only to have her transfer blocked due to, quote, undocumented performance problems, despite the fact that she'd hit every target set for her. Fowler then heard similar stories from other female employees who made up a tiny minority of the overall workforce and resigned in late 2016. Now, Kalanick had always had tech bro vibes. His list of 14 business principles included always be hustling and super pumped. But his public brand had become increasingly toxic over the years, especially after his infamous boober quip and a promotion in France offering rides to, quote, sexy girls. Fowler's blog was the last straw, prompting an internal investigation which ended with the removal of at least 20 employees, including Senior Vice President of Engineering Amit Singhal. Later that month, Kalanick himself was recorded arguing with a disgruntled Uber driver and telling him to take responsibility for his own shit. And by March, the New York Times published an expose on Greyball, the software that we mentioned earlier. Kalanick resigned a few months later, along with his right-hand man, Emil Michael, who hit the headlines in 2014 for suggesting that Uber could hire private investigators to dig up dirt on unfriendly journalists. Beset by scandals and lawsuits, it looked like the beginning of the end for Uber. But today, things are better than anyone could have imagined 7 years ago. Under the relatively conservative stewardship of Dara Khosrowshahi, Uber's stock has tripled over the past 2 years. Its market cap is now over $150 billion, and last year it posted its first ever annual operating profit. Uber is now by far and away the most popular ride-sharing app in the world, with 150 million monthly users and something like 70% of the total market share. Now, Khosrowshahi has achieved this by doing some standard stuff, cutting costs, raising prices, and accelerating Uber's withdrawal from more experimental ventures like China, Russia, and Southeast Asia. But it's also because Uber is no longer just a ride-hailing company. Uber now has a lucrative app business that rakes in over $1 billion a year. Uber Eats is now the second biggest meal delivery app in the US, behind only DoorDash, and Uber recently acquired Postmates, a smaller meal delivery app in the US. As well as people and food, Uber now delivers goods from local retailers with Uber Direct, and is even looking to get into the travel business via a prospective acquisition of Expedia. Khosrowshahi has said that he wants Uber to be the, quote, operating system for everyday life, the app you use to get anywhere or anything, something akin to China's so-called super app, WeChat, which also does basically everything. Various Western companies, including most notably Elon Musk's X, have tried to emulate WeChat's total dominance, but to little avail. And while Uber might not feel like an obvious contender, its dominance in the travel space, and the fact that unlike X, most of its users actually spend money on the app, might give Khosrowshahi cause for optimism. Now, as a TLDR viewer, it's clear you have a thirst for learning. Now, if you want to continue your learning journey, you really should check out Brilliant. Brilliant is the online learning platform where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. These hands-on lessons have you comparing circuits to understand voltage and current, playing snooker to learn the rules of collision, planning your itinerary for an intergalactic music festival on a space-time diagram, and much more. That way, you'll build your natural intuition while gaining deep knowledge of scientific principles. In fact, Brilliant recently added tons of new data science content, all of which uses real-world data to help you see trends and make better informed decisions. And don't worry, you don't need to be a world-renowned scientist to understand these courses either. Brilliant's courses are designed for learners of all levels. Find out more and try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR or clicking the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription by clicking our link. Thanks for your support, and thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.